My name's Ryan Glover. I'm from a little town called Oak Park, which is about 20 minutes outside of Chicago. And I spend my days freelancing. It's me and my cat. It's also known as my CTO. I spend my time doing freelance work on interface design, and more recently, a lot of stuff with Meteor. And I've been working with Meteor for about 2 years now, and so through that time and through that process, I've kind of picked up an idea of where I think Meteor is headed on its own, but also the implications that Meteor is going to have for us as developers and our entire industry. So I want to start today by telling you guys a story. And this story is about me a few years ago, long before all this Meteor stuff and what I was up to. So this was me. I was basically the Peter Parker of the web development industry. Like I had not a lot of skills. I spent my time building interfaces with HTML and CSS, but when it came to JavaScript, this was about it. I understood jQuery, and I could wire the APIs up, and I could fade stuff in and out, but I wasn't, a JavaScript programmer. So if I ever had a conversation with somebody who understood this stuff, they're like, "Oh, so do you know about all this JavaScript stuff?" I'm like, "Sort of." I can put the pieces together. And so the real extent of my programming knowledge at that point was something like WordPress. I could build a theme, and I could work with clients, and I made a living, but that was it. I wasn't a developer in the traditional sense. And so I always felt like this is what other developers looked at me like. We'd have conversations, and they'd be like, "Are you serious? You can't call yourself a developer. You're not a programmer. Just get out of the room, go home." And this kind of bummed me out because I really started out wanting to build applications. When I first got started on the web about 8 years ago, I remember seeing some of the early Rails stuff, some of the playing with PHP and things like that, and it just always looked cool. It's like, okay, I want to build the interface and make that look nice, but I want to wire it to a backend. I want a database. I want to be able to make something and people click it and it blips and bloops and does what you expect it to do. And so I kind of meandered for a few years there and picked up skills as a freelancer, and then this happened. So one day over lunch, I'm sure this is very familiar, I decided I'm going to check Hacker News and see what's out there. And this story popped up. And at the time, if I recall correctly, this is when a lot of JavaScript frameworks were flooding the scene. It was every new thing in the world was Backbone was coming out. Ember, I think, was starting to pick up speed. I don't know if Angular was out yet, but there was just all this stuff. So it kind of felt noisy to me. I read this and I was like, "Oh, okay, here we go again." Another person telling me how to organize my code. But I decided to check it out. And this is what I saw. Pretty simple, a new way to build apps, which I had heard before. We'd all heard before. But then I clicked on that video off to the side and watched it for a few minutes. And it was really interesting because not only was it a short amount of code, I didn't really care about that, but they explained in the video, "Oh, well, this is wired to a live database. This isn't a local data store, like local storage or something like that. This is connected to a MongoDB database, and when you see changes on screen, what's actually happening is we're changing the underlying data. So we're not just polling against a server using AJAX calls. This is responding to whatever happens in your database," which is nuts. And so this was a real convenient picture. Mind you, at this point, this is 2012-ish, summer 2012, right after this announcement was made. And I decided I'm going to spend a weekend to look at Meteor. I saw that post during the week, and I'm like, all right, I'll kill a Saturday by myself. And I thought it was neat. I dug this up because it was, all those years ago, and ended up being way ahead of me actually getting involved with this stuff. And so 1 year after that weekend I spent kind of playing with Meteor. And at that time, it wasn't really full baked. I think it was at 03 or something like that, so really early release. And I played with it, and I was like, "Oh, okay." And I just got back into my work, back into the WordPress, HTML, CSS, jQuery. But during that time, I started to get a little more comfortable with vanilla JavaScript and writing JavaScript in general. So 1 year after that, this happened. And this was a book written by two guys, one from Australia, his name's Tom Coleman, and another who, I guess you could call him more of a designer. His name's Sasha Grief. He's got somewhat of a following online. And teamed up to write this book, and they said, hey, we've been working with Meteor for the past year since that announcement post, and we think it's really cool. And they were the first ones to really figure out how this stuff worked. The documentation was okay, but it wasn't something where you could just dive in, read a tutorial, and just get started with Meteor. So this was like the first big one. And so they announced this in the winter of 2013, and I think it came out the beginning of spring, and I picked it up and started working with it almost immediately when it came out. And I like to equate that moment to like the time when like Peter gets bitten in Spider-Man. It was like, wait a minute. So I can do all this stuff using nothing but JavaScript. I'm writing to a database. It's quick. I understand it. Holy shit. Like, this is a big deal. So that happens, and I spend the next few weeks starting to learn how to do stuff like this, like climb walls. Like, okay, I can get some data into a database. I can retrieve it. I can do updates to stuff. I can do it. And the whole time I'm thinking, like, well, wait a minute. I'm just using the skills that I have. And mind you, this is jQuery skills. This isn't like I know JavaScript. You could ask me any question. You can still do this today, and I have no idea. You guys are all brilliant. I have no clue how you do it. But it was enough where I understood and was able to start building stuff. And so at the time while I was working with all my clients, I always had to write a lot of timelines and a lot of stuff that was just like all that like administrative stuff that keeps like business people comfortable. And so I decided that I was going to take the skills I was picking up, and I ended up building this. And this is interesting because this app is still live. I haven't touched it in a year and a half, 2 years. I deployed it with Meteor, and it took me about 2 to 3 weeks to write it. And it's pretty simple. It's got maybe 3 to 4 views, and you can insert a couple of things in the database, and basically it allows you to track a timeline for your projects. You can say, like, here's when I'm going to do this, here's when this next meeting is going to be, and stuff like that. And so it took me 2 to 3 weeks, which was like, well, okay, I'd never written an application before in my life, ever. And I was able to use this code I had, so it was just this kind of incredible experience. And I realized, well, okay, I've got a bigger idea. I want to build something beyond this. And so that bigger idea was all of those pieces that I had to manage projects. It was, you know, I had a contract, I had this timeline, I had to manage scope documents, all these things that I just hated doing by hand because I was doing it in like Adobe InDesign and stuff that took me hours and I wasted it. So I was like, well, I understand Meteor a little bit now, so I'm going to build this thing. So for about 3 to 4 months over the summer of, it would have been 2013, I decided to build this. And so this is an octopus, but actually this is the landing page for an app I built called Proper, which allowed you to do all of those things. It allowed you to manage your contracts and get them signed. So actually doing like cryptographic signatures on the contract and managing all of those different pieces, all the timelines, all the scope, of all of that stuff into one place. And I did it in 3 to 4 months. Again, didn't have a lot of experience, but I was able to roll out a production grade app that ended up getting customers. So people handing me money and saying, like, here, go, you know, do this. It wasn't a lot of people, like 5 to 10, but it was enough to say, like, okay, this is powerful. I took these basic set of skills and transferred it to this to make something real, something tangible. This wasn't just me sitting in my apartment like, I'm going to be a millionaire one day. This was like real, and that was really neat. And so I worked on Proper for just about a year, and during that time, I did a lot of this. So this is a blog post. I think this is before I launched the actual application. Rolling up to all this, just to do a little bit of promotion for the application, I decided to write technical posts. How do you do this with Meteor? How do you do this stuff? And it started out as just kind of like something to do on the weekend, but it ended up being a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that experience of teaching people and taking like this, you know, somewhat ambiguous problem and breaking it into steps and teaching people. And so during the course of Proper, I wrote maybe a handful of these, and out of all the stuff that I wrote on the site, all the contract stuff and the business stuff kind of got ignored, but all the Meteor stuff was picked up. People were like, oh, this is cool. Thank you for showing me this. And so in the fall of 2014, I was totally over Proper. I didn't want to work on it. I hated contracts. I hated all that stuff. I didn't want to run it as a business. So I sent out a post or an email to all the customers and said, like, I'm going to refund your money. I'm shutting this thing down. I'm over it. And this should be familiar, we're all kind of geeks here. I had to fill that void. I was like, okay, well, I'm shutting down this project. I need to fill it with something else. I have to do something. So I decided, instead of throwing all away that knowledge that I picked up on Meteor, I'm going to start writing about Meteor. I'm going to kind of expand on this idea of teaching people. So this started in November 2014, and the idea of this site, it's called the Meteor Show, is that I teach you how to build real-world things using Meteor. So I'm not just talking about the code, not just like the APIs and like how the underlying stuff works, but how do we actually build something real with this? And so I've been doing this for about the past year, and it's gotten a little more serious, and it's kind of why I'm standing up here. And so through that time and working with Meteor and doing all this stuff, I've gotten pretty comfortable with it and started to realize that there's something unique going on here. All this stuff is so simplistic, and Venkat touched on it this morning. It's so simplistic, it just keeps you focused. And I keep getting the same comments on the site and having conversations with developers like, yeah, this is really easy. I'm not this like really talented programmer or anything, but I understand like basic JavaScript, and I can use this. Like, I read your post and I can go build an API, or I can wire up Stripe to my app and make money on the weekends, and it's crazy. So what are we going to talk about? What are we going to get into today, and what is this all about? So a couple of big points I want to focus on. The first is who is working on Meteor. That's sort of this ambiguous thing. There is a team that supports Meteor, but they're not really out in the public that much. They're pretty focused on the code, so we're going to talk about who that is. We're going to focus on what is Meteor and why is it unique. So what is so special? Why am I sitting up here talking to you? Why should you even spend your time caring about it? And then we're going to talk about Meteor as an equalizer. And that's on that idea of making it possible for people like us, who I would imagine mostly work on the front end, building interfaces and stuff like that, and maybe a little bit of back-end work, how it's going to equalize the development industry for us and give us a little more power and help us 10x our skills with the same exact stuff we've already got. And then I'm going to talk about Meteor's impact on web development from the perspective of how it's going to help us to work a little bit better in our jobs and our businesses and building companies too, if that's something you do. And then before we wrap up, we're going to talk about where is Meteor headed. So give you guys an idea of the landscape, how Meteor is evolving, some of the cool stuff that's coming around the corner, and do that. So who is working on this? Does anybody know? Has anybody heard about Meteor before or anything like that? That guy? Okay. So I like to think of it, and your response is appropriate, because I like to think of them like this. It's the X-Men. There's this team of people somewhere in San Francisco in a bunker somewhere working on Meteor, and they've been given all this money to work on it, but it's like, oh, who the hell is it? So it's actually this group of folks. And they're known as the Meteor Development Group, or MDG, inside of the Meteor community. And they're responsible for a few things. So first and foremost, they're responsible for working on Meteor as a platform, so writing the code and the systems that actually make up Meteor applications. But something that's unique, and I haven't really seen before, is that, and this is what all the money is for, they've been invested in to the tune of something like $40 million at this point. They're trying to build a service called Galaxy, which is going to allow us as developers to simplify the deployment workflow for our apps, production-grade deployments, down to one command. So something that's unique about Meteor is when we're working with it, they try and strip out all of these pieces that we generally spend a lot of time working on up front before we even write any software or any code to do anything. We're always working on configuration like grunt scripts and gulp scripts and all this stuff that isn't the actual work we're trying to accomplish. And so Galaxy is focusing on one piece of that, and it's going to be a paid service where basically we can just CD into our application, type Meteor deploy, give it a URL, and it's deployed. It's live, which is awesome. And so they're trying to build a business around that. We'll see how that works out. And then the other half of what they do is consulting around Meteor. So I think it's about maybe a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, they announced that they're doing something called developer subscriptions. So they offer paid support mostly for enterprise-sized businesses who want to get support with their Meteor applications, like, our server's on fire, help us, tell us what to do. So the next question is, what exactly is Meteor? And so in order to really understand what Meteor is and how all this stuff fits together, it's important to understand, first and foremost, that Meteor is not one of these. It's not an Angular, it's not an Ember, it's not something that's going to help you structure your front-end code. It's not like an MVC framework. It's not something to give you structure. Instead, Meteor is actually an allied group of technologies that are designed to help you build applications with JavaScript really quickly, or as the community has kind of collectively figured out, it's best thought of as a platform. And so when we think about a platform, we're actually talking about something like a Windows or a Unix or a Linux, where we're getting these pre-made tools that make it easier for us to write software on that platform. And what's interesting about Meteor is they're trying to apply that methodology of like, okay, we're going to give you a bunch of libraries and all the tools you need to go and build software, but we're doing that for the web. So instead of, like you're going out and building like native Windows software, you're building something like this, which is really unique. And to really understand this, we have to understand how the web has worked pretty much up until like the last 5 to 6 years here. And so when I, as a user, or you as a user, visit a website, you click a link, and that's going to fire off a request to a server. And what's happening when we do that is that goes to the server, and the server says, okay, you want this specific page, you want this specific data. I'm going to compile all this stuff together and create that one static page, all the JavaScript, everything you need, and send that single page back down the wire to you, which worked for static documents, right? Like the web started out as this platform for delivering like scientific documents. So this kind of like one page at a time thing made sense. But then around, it was 2007 maybe, 2008, when we started to see applications like Google Calendar come into play, okay, now we're trying to build software in the browser, which is kind of a big shift. It requires a lot of different stuff. And so to build stuff like that, we've built a lot of different frameworks. We build a lot of different tools to get this stuff to work. And looking at that, Meteor kind of said, like, well, there's got to be an easier way to do this. Like, can't we simplify the process so we're not doing things like AJAX requests and pulling against servers, like all of these multiple hits to a server? Can't we simplify that down? And so in Meteor, what we're actually doing is building all of the code that we need on the server first. So when the user makes their first visit to the app, we're actually bundling everything they need on the client to handle that presentation layer. So we're no longer doing our HTML on the server and all that stuff. We're actually sending them everything they need to render stuff through templates and all your client-side code directly to the client. So each browser is responsible for rendering the actual data. And so the server is responsible for communicating those data changes. So in Meteor, we have something called Live Query that does two things. It watches for data changes on your master database, so something that's up in the cloud in the server. And then it also watches for changes locally on the individual client. So each client, when they get that first bundled app through Meteor, they're actually getting a local data cache, which is different. And this is done through something called mini-Mongo. So basically, the Meteor development group took the idea of MongoDB and all the APIs. You guys familiar with Mongo and how it works, like the insert, update, all that stuff? They took that and simplified it down so it would work on the client. And so what we get then is we're actually writing data on the client to a database, and then that database is using something called Live Query to sync those changes to the backend, which may not make a lot of sense, but when you think about it, what happens on screen for the user is they make a change, and it happens instantaneously. And so behind the scenes, Meteor is taking that data and saying through Live Query and something they've created called DDP, sending that change to the server and saying, okay, let's go ahead and store this change. And if that change doesn't work, go ahead and revert it on the client. But basically, as a user, you're getting that immediate experience of like, oh, I just added that to the page. So it's starting to feel closer and closer to that native desktop application, which is really different. And so you may be thinking like, well, yeah, that's neat, but don't we kind of have all this stuff already? Like, don't we have the tools to build this stuff? And the answer is sort of. And that's where we're kind of going to steer this stuff now. So something that Meteor thought about in addition to all of the code and how this stuff works is the development experience. And when we talk about the development experience, that's what we do every day. You know, like when we sit down at our desk to work, that development experience is something that is important. It's something that matters. You know, we should care about how we're going about building this stuff because that's a significant amount of time. Getting started up just to write software it's pretty time consuming. And so the Meteor development group kind of sat down early on in Meteor's life and said, like, well, why don't we just simplify that process? And so to do that, and this is a radical simplification of this idea, but they've split it into two pieces. And that is a command line tool, which basically gives you all the stuff that you need throughout the process of your day of building applications to just automate that process. And we've seen command line tools before, right, with stuff like Rails and things like that. But this is really, really well thought out. And so it's one of those things that it's hard to see. And we're going to see in a second because we're going to look at some code and play with Meteor. But it's really important how this one piece really evolves how we do our work. And so on the other side of this is packages. And some of you may have heard of this, but Meteor itself is actually made out of packages. So they've come up with an API for structuring your code into modules that they refer to as packages. And everything in Meteor is a package. So by default, when you create a Meteor application, you get a package called Meteor Platform, which is actually this wrapper around a bunch of other packages. Which is kind of confusing, right? It's like Inception. Basically, when we load up our app, we get those packages, but we also get access to third-party community packages. So if you've worked with NPM and stuff like that, you're familiar with that process of like, okay, I want some library, I can pull it down into my app. But Meteor sort of streamlined that in that we don't have to go through multiple steps just to install this stuff. It's built into that command line tool. So we're adding stuff directly to our app, and Meteor is going to manage those dependencies for us. So all the versioning, all that stuff, we don't have to go maintain like a package.js file and update all this stuff. It's automatically doing this for us, so we can just focus on what we want to do, which is write software. And so we're going to try and do a quick demo here. And what I want you to pay attention to isn't the code. I want to just put the code aside. I want you to pay attention to the development workflow and how fast I'm able to do this stuff. I think we can do it in about 5 to 10 minutes here. And what we're going to do is build a very, very simple application showing you how we can take an input field, insert some data into a database, and get it to appear live on the screen, and also respond in real time to those changes. So seeing that live query sort of working. So, all right, take a sip of water here. Oh no. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do, and I've already installed Meteor, but if you wanted to install Meteor later, it's on OS X and Linux machines. It's a single command. You just curl on an address and it pipes in your shell and installs everything you need for Meteor. It's one command. There's not like a bunch of stuff. You don't have to update Xcode or anything crazy like that. And for Windows users, you can use it's a GUI interface. So you download an exe and install it, and it's pretty quick. So when we're talking about making a Meteor application, what we actually have to do is start by doing Meteor create, and then we want to pass it a name. So because we're all happy and friendly, and I like cowboys, we're going to call this Howdy. So we're going to create an app called Howdy, and you can see pretty quick, Meteor spins up an app for us, and it says, okay, we need to cd into Howdy, and then it's telling me to call Meteor. So let's pay attention here to what's going on. So relatively quickly, Meteor runs all this stuff across the screen and then says, okay, your app's running at localhost 3000. So what they just did was they built the initial code, and so each Meteor app gives you like some boilerplate code that you can start with. But it also spun up a database, connected you to that database, and then gave you a live reloading server on port 3000. So if we go ahead and refresh this, we can see our app pops up, and we get this like simple like clicky thing like, okay, who cares, like we've got a button. So what we're going to do is modify this a little bit so that we can get that input, and I want to show you just how simple it is to actually get data into a database. So what we're going to do, cd into Howdy, and let's make sure this is up in my editor. Okay. So the first thing I really want to do is to make this look a little bit nicer. I want to show you how packages work. So I want to add Bootstrap to this. And that's pretty common. A lot of us work with Bootstrap, right? Yeah? Okay, so to add a package in Meteor, I don't have to go to like another website. I don't have to do anything like that. I can just do this. I can just say, okay, and I'll explain the syntax here in a second. But I can say TWBS:bootstrap. And once I hit enter, Meteor is automatically going to add Bootstrap to this for me. But did you see what just happened? It automatically installed it in the application, loaded all the code on the client. I had to do nothing else. So it's pretty incredible. I love that. So once we've got that package installed, what we need to do now is go ahead and add some templates. So by default, Meteor ships with their own front-end framework. It's called Blaze. And it works with a combination of handlebars templates and some logic that they give you, some APIs that they give you. It's pretty simplistic, but it's a great way to get started with this stuff quickly. And we are going to talk about stuff like React and Angular in a little bit, so hang in there if you're curious about that. So we've got this template hello, and we've got that button that we were clicking, but what I want to do actually is get an input field into this that we can insert some data. So we're going to give it a name, and we're just going to call it title. And then let's give it a class since we're using Bootstrap here. What is it, form control? Something like that. And so I can save that, and instantly these changes are live reloading. I haven't had to start a live reload server or anything like that. There's no build scripts involved in this. It's just automatically given to us. So again, we can focus on work. And pay attention to that. I went from saying, okay, here's what we're going to build, to starting to build it without any additional steps in between, which is pretty big. So we've got this button here, and let's give that a little bit of a style too, just for funsies. So button success. Okay, so let's get rid of this. And you can see that when it comes to templates in Meteor, we define our templates with these just simple template tags and passing a name. And then we do inclusion with the kind of handlebarsy double mustache thing with the arrow. So it's pretty simplistic. And right now, I should explain, the way I'm doing this, I'm doing it in kind of like a monolithic way. We're just using single files for this. But you can use file structure in Meteor. That's the common approach for seasoned developers working with Meteor. You can break your code up into a client server for code that runs on the client, and a server code for runs on the server, and a bunch of other stuff. So it's not a total mess. You don't have to worry about building these huge clunky things. So we've got our hello app, and we've got our form. And let's actually go ahead and make another template real quick, which is going to give us a way to output our data. So again, we're just using handlebars here, so we're going to get a simple each loop, and we're going to pass it something called items, which we'll define in a second. Oops. Okay. And then we're just going to put out a simple list item, and we're going to pass title. So what we're going to do is create a database or a collection on our database where we can store this information, and we're going to expect that each of our objects that are going into the database have a title property that we can access. And so this each is going to allow us to loop over those and do all that. So got that, and actually I forgot some UL tags here. Okay. And actually, so we know that this is working, we can add an else statement and say no items yet. Oops. Okay, so we've got our placeholder statement saying like, okay, this isn't returning anything, so I'm just going to return this else statement, say no items yet. So now what we need to do is we need to set up a database and some logic. And so this is going to take a second. We're gonna have a lot of stuff to do, so you guys might be late to your next talk. I don't know. We'll see. So to set up a collection in Meteor, it's a one-liner. All we have to do, and we can assign this to a global variable so it's accessible to both of our client and server code and all of our files. But all we do is just items equals new meteor.collection, and then we pass it a name as a string for what it's going to actually be stored as in MongoDB. And that's it. It's created a collection and a database. Like it's done. We don't have to do anything else. And so now we have access to this, and we can write on it, we can read from it, we can update it, we can do whatever we want to it. So we're going to modify this code a little bit. And again, let's get rid of all this stuff because we don't need it. Actually, we don't even need this server stuff. So what we want to do is, remember again, we have this button here. And the way that Meteor does this, not to get too codey with this, but you can define event maps for each of your templates. So everything is scoped down to the template level. We're not having to write like these like crazy spaghetti jQuery codes where it's like, you know, using classes and all that stuff to target things. It's all down to that individual template. So when we say click button, it's only looking for that button inside of that template. It's not looking all over your application. And so we need to get the value of that. So we're going to create a little variable here, and we'll just call it title. And something that's nice with Meteor is when we define an event handler, we get access to the event as well as the template instance in the event. So we can just call this like this. We can do template. And Meteor's given us a couple of helpful things. This is similar to something like jQuery. They've just given us some like common helper methods that we can call off the template. So find is one of them. And I think we gave it a name. We did. Okay, so we're just going to look this up and say name equals title. And we want to get that value. And then I want to say if title, actually, I messed this up. We want to insert an object into our database. So we're going to make that an object. And we're going to set a property called title. Does that make sense? Not too confusing? Okay. So let's update this here. Okay, there we go. So what we really want to do is say item.title. So if we have an item.title, and this was the like mind blow for me when I was in that jQuery phase and just starting to do this stuff. All you have to do to get something into a database is call in that global collection variable and then just insert what you want. That's it. It's that easy. And then just for fun, we're going to throw an alert in case, we'll say you need a title. Okay. So we do this, and our browser should refresh on the side. Actually, was it that quick? Let's see. It wasn't. What did I break? So items insert alert. Let's see. Unexpected token. What did I forget? Oh, we've got a semicolon somewhere. All right. Deep breaths. All right. So now, there we go. Okay. So now we're getting that alert. We don't have anything in the input. So we're going to go ahead and type something. Testing 1, 2, 3. And we're clicking, but nothing's really happening. Hello, MWJS. Nothing's really happening. And this is because we actually need to wire up our database to our template. So to do that, we're going to add some template helpers. Again, we're going to call template, and then we're going to call the template name. So in this case, because we're looking to add items on the items template, we'll call that. So we'll say items helpers. And then we just define a method. And this method name is going to map exactly to what we defined in the template. So this items part right here, if I was to call this pizza, we would call it pizza in here. So it maps one for one. And then to get data out of the database, all we need to do is say, let's call this items. And then we just call in the collection items.find. Then if we get items, we return some items. Okay. And there we go. So that quickly, we were able to connect to our database. We can see that our data is inserting. But the really cool part is we can just say, like, hello. And without any real logic or anything like that, I'm not writing anything to wire this. It's automatically responding to those data changes on the client. So we make a change in the database, and the client's like, oh, okay, something changed, and populates it into the DOM, which is pretty slick. So that's a basic idea of how this works. But that was pretty cool, right? Like, it only took me a few minutes, and one little screw up that was my fault because of a semicolon, and we're inserting stuff into a database and pulling it out. And of course, it's a lot more complex than this, right? Like, you can build much more powerful apps than this, but that workflow, I wasn't caught up by configuration. I wasn't caught up by this stuff that we have to deal with day to day of like sweating through all these configuration scripts, and then you have to have that awkward conversation with somebody like, well, I didn't get any work done today because I was writing a grunt script and it wasn't doing this, it wasn't compiling stuff correctly, and then the other person is not technical, so they're just looking at you like, what are you talking about here? This is crazy. So it's a nice way to kind of get around that situation where you have to explain all the technical stuff to somebody who's non-technical, and you can just go really, really fast, and it's just more of a Zen thing. You know, for me, working on this stuff day to day, it's nice when I can be like, you know, like riding the bus back to my house and have an idea, and I just sit down and start working. I don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops. And so that gets us to this idea that we want as low a TTD as possible, and this is my little made-up term for it, but time to development. You know, we want to save all of that time up front so we can just start focusing on writing code and doing what we do. And I like this quote to kind of explain it, which is, don't confuse motion and progress. A rocking horse keeps moving but does not make any progress. And if you think about this in respect to web development, how much of our time is wasted like doing geek stuff like, well, okay, I'm going to write this build script and I'm going to do all this stuff, but then I got to figure out what front-end framework I'm going to use. Okay, and then I got to figure out how I'm going to map that to a database and do all this stuff. And we end up wasting a lot of time up front on that stuff. And we usually do it for every single project. Like there's this dream or this notion that, okay, I'm going to sit down 1 week and I'm actually going to build my own framework and I'm going to do this so I can just repeat it and it's going to be easy. But we never really get there. And it's because there's so much stuff and there's so many decisions to make that it just makes it too hard to do this stuff. And so we waste a lot of time doing it. And I like to think of this, and I'm going to pick on San Francisco since we're in the Midwest, but I like to think of all of the stuff that we have to do with and all these considerations and all this just overwhelming stuff is kind of like the fog of technology. Like we're constantly in this fog where we have to think about all these things, and we don't really need to. Like in some cases maybe, like there's a really technical implementation, but for a lot of stuff like building simple business apps and doing stuff for our clients, we don't need to waste all this time. So I like to think of something like Meteor as like a clear day at the Golden Gate Bridge. It's so nice. And for dramatic effect, we'll go back. And it's like, and I know you all feel this. I've felt it. I get overwhelmed all the time writing this stuff and building these things that, you know, like I'm proud of it. It's cool. And Venkat talked about it this morning. Like you build these things and it polishes your ego. It's great, but it's not doing what we've set out to do. And when I think about all this stuff, I also think about this quote. And this is from a book called From Darwin to Munger. It's pretty cool. And it's talking about focus and talking about how we do things. This is more applied to business, but I thought it mapped really well to all this code stuff, which is it's impossible for our brain to think too many things at the same time and expect to do well. Shifting our mental attention between tasks costs time and comprehension, especially when we switch between more complicated and unfamiliar tasks. So if you think about that in your day-to-day, how much stuff, there's probably that set of stuff that you're really, really good at and you understand really well, but then there's all that other stuff where you're like, and we're opening the documentation, and I got to spend 2 hours reading through this documentation. I don't understand it. Now I'm in a forum, and now, okay, well, I need to take a break. I'm on Hacker News, and I lose that focus. Exactly what Venkat was talking about. I lose that focus. But notice as we were going through the code, did we lose focus? No. We just focused on the code and did what we do. And that's the idea. The focus is on writing software, not code. Say that with me. Everybody say that out loud. The focus is on writing software, not code. So we're coders in that sense, but what we really do is we build software. We build things that people can use to do their jobs, to maybe make us a little money, like send our kids to college or like be millionaires one day. And so this is really convenient. Each month, Meteor hosts something called a Dev Shop out in San Francisco. So apologies for the whole bridge thing. But they host a dev shop where basically Meteor developers can come out, hang out and hack on projects, but they also do talks. And I was watching this. This one came out about 2-3 weeks ago. And a fellow Meteor developer, Raul Chowdhury, stepped up, and I had to pause the video. I was like, wait a minute, that T-shirt is awesome. And it has a very important message on it, which is software is about people. And when we think about people, there's actually two sets when we're talking about this stuff. There's us as developers. We're human beings. I know some people don't treat us that way, but we are humans. And so it's important that we're at peace when we're doing this stuff, when we're doing our jobs. We shouldn't be anxious all the time or stressed out worrying about all this code and managing all these things and having to explain ourselves. We should just be able to write the code. But also, it's about people like this guy. So we've got all these people who are using the stuff that we build. And a lot of them are like this. They're sitting in a cubicle. They have to do all these silly little tasks all day. And we have the power to write this stuff that makes it easy for them to do it. But not just them. This is also, like if you're running a startup or something like that, it makes it easier to deliver whatever solution you have to whatever problem. But at the end of it, it's people. There are human beings that are going to use this stuff, and we should really focus on that idea of delivering these solutions as easily as possible and not muddying things up with, that conversation of like, well, I've got to do all this tech stuff and all that, and it bums people out. And if you think about, if any of you work in a company and you go into a meeting, it's really exciting at first. Somebody has an idea like, well, we need this piece of software to, manage our accounting or something like that. And you're like, oh, I can build an app for that. But then you get into that conversation of, well, it's going to take me some time to get started up, and I'm going to have to do all this stuff. We're going to have to manage all these processes. We might need to hire an extra person. We might need to do all this stuff. But with something like Meteor, like you can go back to your desk by yourself after lunch and build a prototype of whatever you just talked about in a few hours and ship that by the end of the day. It may not be production grade yet, but think about that. A few hours in the afternoon, and you can say, okay, I solved your problem. It's a little buggy, but I've given you an answer to that. And then think about the scope of time of like, okay, building stuff in Meteor, it might take me about a month to get something production grade, and I ship it. So not only are projects being greenlit with this stuff, but we're actually shipping software. So you don't go through that process, that soul crushing of, okay, I've got this idea and we're going to build it, and then managers get involved, and well, now we have to manage this tech, and well, we got to go make 5 more decisions about which database we're going to use and which front-end framework, and it's like really all we want to do is just build software, give it to people, and go home. That's all we want to do. At least that's all I want to do most of the time. So one of the big questions is, where is all this stuff headed? Meteor is currently at 1.103, so it's really early days. And I want to underscore that because I know a lot of people try and compare Meteor to what's out there now, and we're in a really convenient spot where we've got these frameworks and all these technologies that are pretty mature. Stuff like Rails is compared to Meteor a lot. All these PHP frameworks. That we're kind of like at the end of this era where we've built those kind of traditional HTTP apps that I talked about, building the static pages and stuff. And now we're going into this sort of cloud era. And so we've got all of this stuff from that old era that we're trying to compare to this, and it's not really fair. I mean, back in, I think it was 2005, Rails hit 1.0. So we're technically around the like 2005 of Meteor. So when I talk about this stuff, I want you guys to think about that in context. Like, it's really early days. It's really early days. So 1.2 is coming out later this summer. There's no official ship date. There was a blog post from the Meteor development group. They're working on a couple of things. So we'll probably see it, maybe end of this month or sometime into September. And features confirmed for 1.2. We're going to get direct support for ES 2015, ES6. So by default, all apps are going to ship. So you saw me do the Meteor Create thing. One of the additional packages that's going to be added for you is called ECMAScript, and it's going to give you access to ES6, everything but modules, via Babel. So like you saw, you're going to write ES6 code in your app, and it's going to automatically compile and do all the stuff behind the scenes, and you get the result on the client, which is really nice. So we don't have to write anything to transpile it or anything like that. We're also getting first-class support for React.js, which is a big deal. I've been playing with that, and it's really, really cool. And it works really well with something like Meteor. So if you're into React and you're playing with that kind of stuff at the conference, get excited because that's coming in a few weeks. It's going to be cool. And you'll be able to tie it to all the back-end stuff I showed you. And same thing for all you Angular guys. I see a couple Angular t-shirts out here. So same exact thing. And then long term, it has been announced that SQL support is in the works. So if you work in a company that's a little nervous about using something like Mongo, SQL is coming. You can't actually do it now. There are a few community packages that give you support for SQL and doing those commands, and it's not mapped to Mongo or anything like that. It's like an actual, I think there's a guy doing Postgres, and then there is another one that's just like regular MySQL. So that's coming. That's pretty exciting. The next is one command deploys to production-grade hosting via Galaxy, which we talked about when we were looking at the Meteor development group. And I didn't show that, but quite literally that code that we had, right now there's an early preview version of this. We can just go into that directory and say Meteor deploy, pass it a URL at meteor.com, and in about 10 to 20 seconds we've got a production app running on a server. And so their goal again is to get that to the point where we can do production grade stuff no maintenance, no configuration. We're just focused on software, but we can support thousands and thousands of users. And then beyond that, continuous improvements to stability and building. And there's another Meteor developer named Josh Owens who talked about this, and he had a pretty good term for how Meteor approaches this stuff, because their cycles seem kind of slow. A lot of people who pay attention to it, doesn't seem like a lot changes, but he used the term meticulous-driven development. And everything that Meteor does is very, not clean in the sense of like it's like that terse code Venkat was talking about, but it's well thought out. Like the steps that we're going to go through as developers have been thought about and considered to the point where the software that we're using to build software works really well, and we don't have to worry about fixing bugs in somebody else's work. So, to everybody here, I say up and away with this stuff. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. Make sure to stay in touch with me. I would love to see how something like Meteor would fit into your workflow, and how it can help you to pick up more clients and do stuff faster at work. I'm really excited because I think it's going to really revolutionize what we do and how we do it. I've set up a full tutorial and demo repo for you. So if you go to themeteorchef.com/recipes/mwjs, there's a full tutorial there that's going to walk you through building a slightly more complicated application called Blip Bloop, which is like a to-do app, but I use some of my lingo in there to build it. And it'll walk you through starting with nothing and going to a full application. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate you having me out here. If you want to find me in the Matrix, Ryan Glover, themeteorchef.com, @themeteorchef on Twitter. I do about 3 to 4 posts a week on Meteor, so I'm pretty heavily involved with it. And I send out an email every Friday. So if you sign up for that and you're curious about this stuff, you'll get that email and see kind of some of the stuff I'm teaching. And if you guys want, I've got free Meteor and Meteor Chef stickers up here when we finish. So thanks. So, any questions? That guy, okay. Any preferred ID? Yeah. So any preferred IDE for Meteor? There's not. It can work with anything. Like you saw me, I was using Atom. There is the WebStorm guys, the JetBrains. I haven't worked with it too much, but WebStorm has pretty good Meteor support with like auto completion and stuff like that. So I know a lot of Meteor developers like to use that. Any other questions? Not any like big companies. There are quite a few production grade applications out there. There's one company called Classcraft. They do like World of Warcraft kind of MMO stuff, but for like the classroom. And they've talked about having like, I think it's like 25 or 30,000 active users a month or something in the application. So there is stuff that's starting to build up, and there's quite a few. If you go to meteor.com, they've got like a list of some of the more popular applications. But yeah, there's definitely stuff that's getting used daily by people.
There's a website made with meteor.com that has a list of a lot of stuff.
Yes. Yeah, he's right. So it's made with meteor.com, and if you work on a Meteor project, you can put it up there, but I think there's like a top 10 or something like that, and it's on a voting system, so you can check out stuff there. Yeah?
Are there any security implications of like the mini Mongo right on the client, in the synchronization process?
Yeah, good question. So when we're talking about security in Meteor, what I showed you is pretty simplistic. You can do a lot of database work on the client. Most Meteor developers will do it on the server. But on the client, they give us something called allow and deny rules. So we can be pretty granular with how we allow data into the database. We can say, like, allow inserts if it's the current user or something like that. So the security is actually pretty good. What you saw, by default, when you install Meteor, it ships with 2 packages called auto publish and insecure. And those are for quick prototyping. They allow you to get all of your data on the client. And they also allow any database operations without any rules. But generally, you remove those and use like a pub sub pattern. And that way you can control the data and who accesses it. And there's also a default user accounts package that you can use to tap into and control who has access to what. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
All right. Anybody else? Yeah.
Is it worth using Meteor
Yeah. So this is something I'm kind of geeked out on lately. The MeteorChef.com is not a Meteor app. It's just a static website. And one of the things I started working with recently was saying like, well, I need a back end because I need to store stuff like I have change logs on each of the posts and things like sponsorships. And I was like, well, you could technically just build an API for this. And I've found that Meteor is really quick for building out what you're talking about, REST API services, and just using like something like a React or something like that to just pull in data through like an AJAX request or something like that. So it's pretty slick. Any other questions? No? Can I see some? Oh, yeah. So there's a few ways to do it. And this is the cool part about Meteor. There's a lot of community work around this. There's a developer from Sri Lanka who's really popular. His name's Aranota, and he wrote a script called Meteor Up, which basically makes it possible to basically decompile your Meteor app into a regular Node.js app and deploy it to any services like that. So it's pretty easy. And then there's another one, a company called Modulus. Some of you may be familiar with them. They do Node.js hosting. They wrote something called Demeteorizer that does kind of a more automated process, the same thing. But you can go, a lot of people have deployed on like DigitalOcean boxes using like, I think it's just like regular Ubuntu. A lot of Amazon EC2, Heroku, Modulus, all kinds of places. So there, you definitely have options. Anybody else? Can I see some smiles? We should be having fun, right? Okay. All right, guys. Well, thanks for hanging out. And if anybody wants to talk, just come and find me.